Do you remember that moment? You're 6 years old, maybe 7. You're lying in bed, eyes squeezed shut, pretending to sleep. And under your pillow, there's a little white tooth. You're waiting. You believe. And in the morning, there will be a coin. That was your first encounter with magic. The first time the world did something unexplainable, personally for you. But here's what I'm going to tell you. What you did that night, it's not a cute fairy tale invented by caring parents. It's a ritual. Ancient, dark, and very specific in its purpose. And that purpose was not at all for you to get a coin. Today, we're going where this came from. And I promise, after this video, you will look at a child's pillow with completely different eyes. Let's start with one simple question that nobody seems to ask. Why a tooth, of all things? Out of everything a child loses, the first step, the first word, the first lock of hair, why did the lost tooth become the center of a ritual that exists in literally every culture in the world? Greece, Japan, Russia, Mexico, Egypt, everywhere, independently of each other. They all looked at this little white tooth and felt the same thing, that something needed to be done with it, that you couldn't just throw it away. This is not a coincidence. It speaks to something very deep about how the human brain is wired. A tooth is part of the body, but not just any part. It's a hard part, the part that remains after death. Bones rot, soft tissue disappears, but teeth remain. In the ancient mind, this meant one thing. The tooth contains something of the soul, something permanent, something that doesn't die. And then a child loses a tooth. A piece of their soul literally lies in your palm. What do you do with it? If you lived in medieval England, you burn it right now, without delay. Wait, let me explain why. Because if you don't, the child will die. Not metaphorically, literally die. That's what people who lived on this land 1,000 years ago believed, and their belief was absolute. The logic was this: a tooth is part of the body, part of the child's soul. If a witch finds it, she gains power over that child, complete power. She can cause pain from a distance, cast a curse, steal their life force. That's why the tooth couldn't just be thrown away. It couldn't be left just anywhere. It had to be destroyed by fire so that nothing remained. Put yourself in the place of a mother in a medieval village. Your child lost a tooth. You're holding it in your hand, and you know as long as this tooth exists, as long as it lies somewhere in this world, your child is vulnerable. Anyone who finds it gains power over them. You go to the hearth and throw the tooth into the fire. This isn't a superstition to you, it's protection. It's the only correct action of a loving mother. And you know what? This tradition of burning baby teeth existed in Europe for hundreds of years. In some regions of Germany and Scandinavia, it survived into the 19th century. Your great-great-great-grandmother quite possibly did exactly this. But burning is only one method, and far from the most interesting. Because there were cultures that went in a completely different direction. They decided not to destroy the tooth's power, but to use it. If you lived in Scandinavia about 1,000 years ago, your child's lost tooth was a treasure. Literally, currency of luck. The Vikings believed that children's baby teeth had protective power. Not just any power, specifically because these were the first teeth, the teeth of an innocent being with no sins and no enemies. Pure power, untainted by life. And warriors took these teeth into battle. They made jewelry from them, strung them on a thread, wore them around their necks or wrists. They went into battle with their children's teeth as amulets. In Scandinavian texts, this was called tandfæ, literally tooth payment. The child lost a tooth, the father paid for it, and received protection. Wait, you just learned that the custom of paying a child for a tooth, it wasn't invented by a fairy. It was the Vikings, warriors who went to kill and wanted to survive. Let me guess, right now you're thinking your childhood was a little different. If so, write in the comments what exactly caught your attention. I'm genuinely curious where the line between cute and wait, what lies for you. So, Europe burned teeth, Scandinavia paid for them and wore them into battle. But there was another tradition that spread so widely that traces of it can be found on 4 continents. Throw the tooth over your shoulder, or bury it in the ground, or feed it to an animal. And each option had its own logic. Throw it over your shoulder. Give the tooth to the spirits of ancestors who stand behind you. Let them take it. Let them carry it far from the living. Bury it in the ground. Return the soul to the earth from which everything came. Feed it to an animal. Transfer its power to a creature whose teeth grow back.
Mouse, rat, dog, animals whose teeth never run out. And here we come to a very interesting point, because the mouse in this story, it's not a random detail. The mouse appears again and again in cultures that never contacted each other. In Russia, they said, throw your tooth to the mouse. Ask it to bring you a new one, strong like its own teeth. In Mexico, the same thing. In India, the same thing. In Japan, a baby tooth from the lower jaw is thrown up onto the roof, and from the upper jaw, down onto the floor, so the new tooth grows in the right direction. They all looked at the mouse and saw the same thing. This is a creature whose teeth never run out. That means it knows the secret. That means it can share. You never thought about this when you put your tooth under the pillow, but your brain, at some very deep level, inherited exactly this logic.
You can't just throw a tooth away. You have to give it away to someone who knows what to do with it. For thousands of years, humanity gave it to spirits, to mice, to fire, to earth, and then she appeared, the fairy. And the story of her appearance, that's a whole other story. About one French book, about Disney, and about how in 100 years, the whole world forgot about burned teeth and mouse mascots and decided that it had always believed in a little winged woman with a coin. More on that in the next part. But first tell me, are you subscribed? Because it's gonna get even more interesting. Next, we'll find out who exactly invented the fairy, when that happened, and why this particular invention defeated all other versions and took over the entire world.
So, you already know that for thousands of years, a lost tooth was an object of fear, magic, and very specific rituals. It was burned, buried, carried into battle, fed to mice, anything, as long as it wasn't left just lying around. But you didn't know any of this when you were little. You knew only one thing. You needed to put the tooth under the pillow, and in the morning, the fairy would come. The question nobody asks, where did this fairy even come from? Who invented her? When? And why did she win instead of the mouse, the fire, the ancestral spirits? The answer to this question is both very simple and very strange, because the tooth fairy is not an ancient myth. It's not a folk tale that's 1,000 years old. It's an invention, relatively recent, and it has a specific date, a specific place, and a specific person who pulled the trigger. But to understand how this happened, we first need to talk about one creature that was in this story long before the fairy. A creature that in some countries still takes the teeth instead of her, and which frankly is far scarier than any fairy with wings. I'm talking about the mouse.
More specifically, about the little good mouse, La Bonne Petite Souris. In French, that means the good little mouse, and that's the title of a fairy tale written in France in 1697 by Madame Delnoy. Here's the story. There is an evil king. He is so evil that a good fairy decides to punish him. She turns into a little mouse, crawls under the king's pillow, knocks out all his teeth while he sleeps, and thus defeats evil. Wait, a fairy turns into a mouse, crawls under the pillow, and knocks out teeth. Do you see what's happening? This is not just a fairy tale. This is the moment when two images, the fairy and the mouse under the pillow, first came together in a single text for the first time in history. This tale became very popular in France. It was republished, retold, adapted, and gradually, across generations, what remained in folk memory was this. There is a creature that comes at night while you sleep and deals with teeth. A creature that is small, magical, and not evil. That's why in Spain, France, Italy, and most of Latin America, there is still no tooth fairy. They have a tooth mouse, El Raton Perez. Perez the little mouse. He lives in a candy box in Madrid, travels through cities, takes teeth, and leaves coins.
Spanish children don't put the tooth under the pillow. They put it in a glass of water so the little mouse can take it easily. You thought the tooth fairy was universal? Half the world lives with a mouse. But we're interested in the fairy. Where did she come from? Let's go back to the early 20th century, America, 1908. A Chicago newspaper publishes an advice column for parents, and there, for the first time in history, the first time, a phrase appears suggesting you can tell a child, put your tooth under the pillow and the fairy will leave you a coin. Just a tip in a newspaper. No big story, no explanation of where this came from. Just try it. Kids like it. But then something interesting happens. In 1927, American writer Esther Watkins writes a short play for children. It's called The Tooth Fairy. This is the first work in history where the Tooth Fairy is the main character, with a name, a personality, and a specific role. The play is short. It was performed in schools, read to children. It didn't become a bestseller, but it did something important. It gave the fairy a face.
Still, the tradition remained local, American, small. And then came Disney. In 1940, Pinocchio was released. In 1953, Peter Pan. In between, dozens of films in which fairies became kind, winged, sparkling, tiny, and very American in spirit. Tinkerbell became an icon. And here's what happens in the mind of a child who grew up on these images. Someone tells them, "Tonight a fairy will come and take your tooth," and they instantly know what she looks like. Small, winged, kind, sparkly. They've seen fairies like that 100 times. Disney didn't invent the Tooth Fairy, but Disney made her visually obvious. He gave the audience a ready-made image that fit perfectly onto the tradition. After World War II, American culture began to export itself around the world at tremendous speed. Movies, television, books, toys, and along with it, the Tooth Fairy. She rode into Europe, into Asia, into Russia on a wave of American cultural influence. Today, the Tooth Fairy is known in over 100 countries, a tradition that, in its current form, is less than 100 years old.
Think about that. For thousands of years, people burned teeth, buried them, carried them into battle, and then in a single century, this entire mass of ancient beliefs was replaced by one image, a tiny good fairy with a coin, invented by an American writer in 1927 and made visually recognizable by Disney. This is one of the fastest cultural revolutions in human history, and you are part of it. If you like what we're doing here, the way we break down ordinary things all the way to the bottom, subscribe, because there are many more traditions ahead that you do every day not knowing where they came from, and some of them are much darker than the Tooth Fairy. But first, one last question I want to ask you, the most important question of this video, not about history, about you. Now you know all of this. You know about burned teeth and Vikings and the French mouse and the American newspaper from 1908. You know the Tooth Fairy is an invention less than 100 years old. Will you still tell this story to your child? That's in the final part. And there, you'll find an answer that I think will surprise you, because it's not about the fairy. It's about why such stories exist at all, and why they work even when you know they're not real.
So, you're still here. You learned about burned teeth in medieval England, about the Vikings who carried children's teeth into battle as amulets, about the French mouse who knocked out the evil king's teeth, about the American newspaper from 1908, and how Disney accidentally became the main architect of one of the most widespread rituals on the planet. And now, I want to ask you a question that none of those who tell this story ever ask. Why does this work? Not why people believed 1,000 years ago. That's understandable. They didn't know biology, they were afraid of witches, they looked for explanations where there were none. But why does it work now? Why do you, an adult who knows there is no fairy, still feel something when you think about this ritual? Why do millions of parents around the world every night quietly pull a tooth from under their sleeping child's pillow and put a coin there, even though they fully understand what they're doing? This is not stupidity. This is not inertia. This is something far more interesting.
Anthropologists call this a rite of passage. It's a moment when a person moves from one state to another. A child loses a baby tooth. That's literally a physical change to the body. They become different, slightly older, slightly closer to the adult world. And all the cultures of the world, independently of each other, felt the same thing. Such a moment cannot simply be skipped. It needs to be marked. It needs to be given weight. Because if you just throw the tooth in the trash and go to sleep, the child won't feel that something important has happened. But a ritual, even a made-up one, even about a fairy that doesn't exist, gives significance to that moment. You woke up in the morning and found a coin. And it wasn't just a coin, it was confirmation. The world noticed that you changed. The world responded. You matter. That's why the Tooth Fairy defeated fire and mice and Viking amulets. Not because she explains the world better, but because she handles the task better, to give the child the feeling that their transition has been noticed and marked. A burned tooth didn't do that. It protected, but didn't celebrate. A Viking amulet gave power to the father, but not to the child. But the
fairy came precisely to the child, precisely for their tooth, precisely to them she left a gift.
This is a brilliant design, not because someone deliberately designed it, but because it accidentally perfectly matched what the human psyche needs. Now, let's return to the question I asked at the end of the previous part. You now know all of this, all the dark history, all the medieval witches, all the Vikings, all the French mouse. Will you still tell this story to your child? I think yes. And here's why. Because knowing the origin of a ritual doesn't destroy its power, it enhances it. The next time you quietly pull a tooth from under your child's pillow, you'll be doing what people have done for thousands of years, in different forms, with different explanations, in different cultures, but with the same intention. To tell the child, this moment matters. You matter. The world sees you. The medieval mother burned the tooth at the hearth. The Viking hung it around his neck before battle. The French nanny told stories about the mouse. The 20th century American mother put a coin. You are doing the same thing.
The chain has never been broken, thousands of years, and you are in it. This is not superstition. This is the language humanity uses to speak to children about growing up. And this language is older than any state, any religion, any civilization we know. There's something else I want to say before we finish. Something that personally amazes me about this story. The Tooth Fairy has existed in its current form for less than 100 years, but the tradition she represents, it's one of the oldest continuous traditions of humanity. We change the form, but not the essence. We remove the fear and kept the care. We remove the fire and kept the coin. We remove the mouse and added wings. But underneath it all, it's the same feeling. The same fear of losing a piece of the child, the same need to pass that piece somewhere, the same instinct to mark the moment of transition. You thought you put the tooth under the pillow because your parents did it, and they did it because their parents did it, and they did it because they read it in an early century American newspaper. But behind this chain, thousands of years of human fear and love melted down into one simple nightly ritual. Not bad for a little white tooth. If this story got to you, hit like, not for the algorithm, but because it's a signal to me, dig further, go deeper, find even more stories like this, because there are many of them. Behind every ordinary thing you do every day stands exactly this kind of story. Dark, strange, and in the end, almost always human. In the next video, we'll break down something you do literally every time you sneeze, a gesture invented by a Roman pope during the plague of the 6th century to stop the devil from entering your body through your open mouth. You say it on autopilot. You never thought about where it came from. Now you will. See ya.